The presentation of this video is titled as Waithood, the gap between childhood and adolescence or adulthood of rural youth and its implications for vocational education. What is waithood? Wikipedia defines waithood as follows. Waithood is a period of stagnation in the lives of young, unemployed college graduates or vocational students in various industrializing and developing nations or regions, primarily in the Middle East, North Africa, and India, where their expertise or learning is still not widely needed or applicable or relevant. Waithood is described as a kind of prolonged adolescence and the bewildering time in which large proportion of youth spend their best years waiting or on the bench, if I had to use the IT terminology. It is a phase in which the difficulties youth face in each of these interrelated spheres of life result in a debilitating state of absolute helplessness, frustration, and dependency. In fact, one commentator argues that waithood can best be understood by examining the outcome and linkages across different sectors such as education, employment, housing, marriage, and so on. A major crisis that is engulfing the education ecosystem is about the semi or uneducated rural as well as the so-called educated urban youth armed with a useless degree, a paper qualification. Increasingly, school to job transitions are seen as difficult and elusive, particularly as relatively educated young men and women find it difficult to get decent employment. Mark my word, decent. Today's generation of young people are more endowed than any previous generation with human capital. However, the oversupply of secondary and tertiary graduates with bookish knowledge on the one hand and the rapid advance of job displacing and replacing technology in almost all the sectors on the other hand means that this is the generation for whom, more than any previous generation, human capital theory is just not relevant. In India, we have many instances of even candidates with PhD degrees applying for a peon or sweeper's job. As per one report in the state of Uttar Pradesh, in northern state of India, for the post of 62 messengers, that is office boys, over 3,700 PhDs, 50,000 graduates and 28,000 postgraduates applied. Now, whether the doctoral and other qualifications had any intrinsic academic value or there is surplus availability of degree holders crowding the job market is another question. If this is the problem with the degree holders, what would be the plight of students with vocational qualifications? As it is, we all know the general perception being that if one is no good in anything, then he or she should at least try his or her hand in the vocational course. That is adding to the depressing mindset of a large majority of youth. In today's world, there are countless examples of the growing problem of the relatively educated unemployed or underemployed or non-employables. In India, young men from rural farm backgrounds engage in what I call as a time pass, enrolling in one course after the another as they fail to find the employment they seek. Added to this, there is another problem that their aspiration levels are completely unrealistic. In northern and sub-Saharan Africa, they are often caught in a period of suspension between childhood and adulthood. And that period is, which I talked about, the Waithood, until well into their 30s. Access to formal sector jobs, even with the right qualifications, may require years of internship, sometimes in conditions approaching servitude. In the Philippines, for example, thousands of graduates of marine higher education institutions work for free, sometimes for years, as utility men or gophers or flunkies in agencies that provide crew to big shipping companies, or sometimes as servants in the homes of their staff, in the hope that eventually they may get a job and a chance to board a ship. In eastern Indonesia, thousands of graduates of teacher training and nursing academies, nearly all of them from rural background, below poverty line background, work for years as semi-volunteer staff in schools and hospitals without contracts and with minimal or unpredictable monthly earnings, again in the hope that after some years they may be appointed to fixed contract positions. It's a long period of waithood. To view these problems as simply a matter of mismatch between education or training and labor demand is a very overly simplistic kind of an explanation. As of now, we are witnessing mass youth unemployment, that includes the educated youth unemployment, and underemployment, which is a structural, chronic, and permanent feature of most economies. And these problems, currently and in the future, disproportionately affect rural youth more than the urban youth. Rural young people experience longer delays in their training to work transitions, and they are 40% more likely to be in casual work without a contract than their urban counterparts, as per one report from the International Labour Organization. Thus, young rural youth's actual labour market experience in many countries falls far below the short of their aspirations and belies the promise of human capital theory. Why does the theory does not work for them? Young people are increasingly faced with the reality that while you cannot get a skilled or semi-skilled job without the relevant diploma in the overcrowded labor markets, having the relevant diploma does not get you the job unless you have other means to open doors, such as personal, familial, network or contacts or influence and relevant work experience, which poor and rural youth are less likely to have. For this generation, then, human capital's underlying assumption and premise that education increases employability is unfortunately not based on credible evidence. Now let me come to another pressing concern about the rural youth. One of the major problems affecting the overall impact and effectiveness of the vocational education, with particular reference to India, has been the lack of interest shown by the below poverty line rural youth in opting for training that can ensure livelihood for them. This is despite many incentives being offered to them almost on a platter. It is not uncommon to find batches after batches of youth getting dropped out during or even after training. Common sense would tell us that the youth who is desperately in need of a job would move heaven and earth to seek opportunities and avenues for livelihood. We have many evidences that the common sense or the prevailing wisdom does not really explain the behavior of these rural youth. What is true of the youth is equally true of farmers. After all, they also belong to the rural milieu. Despite knowing that the present method of farming is not productive, they continue with the old ways. Despite knowing that in handling pesticides, adequate precautions must be taken, it is handled most casually. Technical instructions and protocols are never adhered to. In Senegal, we found that hazardous chemically coated seeds were being washed away in open streams, endangering the lives of many. Year after year, post-harvest loss continues due to reluctance from the farmers to adopt simple yet effective ways to reduce the losses. Despite knowing that smoking causes cancer, still many are compulsive smokers. I have seen personally in many apparel factories, workers hide their daily dose of tobacco and the chewing gum called gutka inside the bread and smuggle it in fully conscious of its bad effects. Despite knowing that savings is a good option during unemployment, people shop compulsively, almost an addictive behavior. Despite knowing that winning the lottery has a minimal chance, youth spend their money in purchasing the tickets. During the pandemic that we are witnessing now, we still observe people not wearing masks and spitting on the roads. These instances contradict the traditional view of men being very logical in their decision or in their decision making process or in the selection of their choices that they make. The so-called mythical youth who is careful and logical decision maker and who knows what is good for him or her does not exist. Instead, we find the youth doing things that will directly harm their prospects in many ways. The behavior pattern is such that it ensures a kind of self-sabotage. In many African countries, rural youth go to the towns and cities and due to the lack of job opportunities get easily absorbed in the crime world. Behavior economics, which is the relatively new branch that culminated out of the understanding of psychology of people and its impact on our economic decisions, tries to offer an understanding to the main theme of this presentation as to why the below poverty line youth, even if offered all kinds of assistance, do not continue and complete their training. As mentioned earlier, we all know human behavior is complex and does not necessarily follow the principle of economic decision making. There is no walk the talk syndrome visible. Let me elaborate on the reasons why the youth take those decisions that are detrimental to their self-interest. All of us have a kind of default setting mechanism embedded in us, which at the slightest threat of change goes back to its original setting, almost like a spring. A new environment in a new setting is a threatening event for the youth, and his or her first impulse is to run back to his or her village. The reverse migration of the youth in hundreds of thousands that was witnessed in India during the onset of the pandemic is proof of this syndrome. Besides, it also saves him or her from making any active choices. That means, even if he or she knows at a rational level that by completing the vocational skills training, he or she may get a job that will take their families out of the poverty trap, they prefer to go for the default setting, which is their preset options. The present is familiar and comfortable, and the future is uncertain. So any trigger that upsets the status quo forces them to retract to their original position. One important point here to be noted is that the migration and its impact on the rural youth is a factor to be studied. I passionately believe that migrating the rural youth to the metro cities after the vocational training is akin to a kidney transplant, where the body tends to reject it. But if employment opportunities are provided, say within 50 miles radius, the youth is most likely to opt for that, even with lower wages, as familiar surrounding is a great motivator. A simple way to break the psychological barrier would be to demonstrate a successfully trained youth or groups of youth who can motivate the fence sitters to join the training. The personality change in the trained youth, the gained confidence of working in a different setting successfully inspires others. When a rural youth sees another youth of the same stock doing very well in a metro setting, I am sure he or she will get motivated adequately, and that inspires them to emulate him or her because he or she becomes a role model. In recent times, we have seen few great examples of US educated and successful graduates with entrepreneurial zeal getting back to their roots in villages and motivating the youth to learn and earn. Let me talk about a concept called 90% achievement syndrome, or what is known as satisfies syndrome. What is this syndrome? Satisfies literally means pursuing a course of option that will satisfy the minimum requirement necessary to achieve a goal or objective. It also means pursuing not the best, but a good enough goal that does not involve any stretch. For example, if people are given a choice of 50 items to study and tick which suits them most appropriately, chances are they would tick the first three to avoid going through the details of the remaining choices. So the tendency to look for easier and non-threatening, non-taxing options often result in making wrong choices and poor decisions. Corporate world has seen this phenomenon during performance appraisal. On a 5-point scale, ranging from very poor to outstanding, more often good is the chosen option. I recall during the early 80s, fed up with this syndrome, a very prominent MNC removed the good, that is the middle option, and what happened is all the poor now became very good. Youth are wary of too much overload of information through booklets, magazines, bulletins, etc. Therefore, if in a simple yet effective way, the messages are communicated about the benefits of training, it might work to motivate them to continue the training. In addition, we must ensure that the cognitive overload has to be balanced. Typically, when a youth is presented with 50 options of courses to choose from, he will run away. Research has proved that efficacy of offering limited choices is the best option. It is here that the principle of nudges come handy in enabling behavior modification. These nudges could be in the form of rigorous entry gate assessment, which identifies the right kind of aptitude present in the candidate so that he can be offered the right kind of course which is compatible with his attitudes. There is also this element to be loss averse than benefits gain. Let me explain. This theory again flies against the rational man theory. Individuals weigh losses more than the gains they might get. So the below poverty line youth, the perceived risks are psychological. What will I do in a new city? How will I survive? I don't know anything in a metro city. Or social, I will lose my familiar environment, my friends, my social circle. Or financial, how will I sustain in an unfamiliar place? So between the choice of losing something and gaining something, he prefers the first one. The counseling must emphasize minimizing the cost and losses more than pointing out a very rosy picture of prospects. So if the messages are about reducing the existing loan burden, improving the health of the family, and livestock, it will be more effective. Messages must be loss framed than gain framed. Also, the counseling need not be limited to the concerned youth, but should also include the elders in the family and the opinion makers from the village as they exercise the final decision regarding the future of the youth. I recall an example of heightened expectations during the launching of a scheme called Udan in the northern state of Jammu and Kashmir. In their anxiety to make the project a success, many trainers painted a very rosy picture of high salary and benefits that a youth might get once he completes the training. Many complaints were made by several parents to the then Minister of Rural Development, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, that when their son or daughter landed in Chandigarh, again the northern state, to join the job, no one from the ministry was there to receive them. Complaints about not being provided furnished accommodation was not uncommon. Few recruited youths in the business process BPO settings complained that they were not allowed to pray 5 times as was promised during the training. Why? Because in their anxiety to attract students, the trainers had raised their expectations to a very unrealistic level and painted a very rosy picture of what they might expect once they complete the training, which is not at all true. We have seen that the youth are generally risk averse when faced with high probability gains or low probability losses. But what is surprising is that they are more risk seeking when faced with certain losses or uncertain gains. They take more risk just to avoid the losses. It's very interesting. This means the perceived threat of being migrated to a new city for a job after training, which is actually a gain, forces them to opt to stay back, which is an actual loss. This tendency to be less risk averse and more risk taking for small stakes gambles than for large stakes is known in the management jargon as a peanuts effect. That is, people are more willing to take a chance when playing for peanuts. That is, risk seeking decreases when the loss stakes are high, such that people are more risk seeking for small losses than for large losses. The walking on feet, hundreds of miles to hometown during the summer than waiting for any rescue mission that we witnessed recently bears a testimony to the above syndrome. Here, we need to identify those risk relievers that will give the comfort to the youth that opting for the training is a low risk proposition. Word of mouth publicity about the efficacy of training, simple booklets, free trial training are some of the tools that can be employed. In agricultural context, the village-based entrepreneurs or proxy sales force agents that companies have started to employ, they can become the friend, philosopher and guide and can influence the youth in the desirable direction. As the youth have spent their efforts, time and resources in the villages, they prefer to spend more in the same way rather than exploring the new options or choices. This is the famous boiled frog syndrome. So if these are the realities of the so-called rational youth who is not rational, how do we create an enabling environment that forces them to think differently? Very carefully, the negative implications of the already sunk costs and the futility of putting in more resources into them needs to be explained. At the same time, if the cost benefit analysis of opting for a new course of action is explained to the family, the impact is more lasting. As I said, the family can exert the peer pressure more on the youth than, let us say, a trainer or an outside person. I have in this short presentation not touched upon many equally critical variables such as the quality of the trainer, the relevant course material, job descriptions, which often unfortunately are camouflaged as job roles, the frustrating bureaucracy, the red tape of the government arms in releasing installments, the role of auditing firms masquerading as experts and performing the magic of being insiders and outsiders at the same time, the fly-by-night training shops, and the irresponsible temptation to chase the numbers than ensuring quality output. These are all very important factors to consider that will need a deeper analysis and a longer discourse. However, let me stress on a critical issue about the selection of the trainer. While we would like to believe that everybody can be trained, it is a fact that those requisite intelligence and aptitudes only people with requisite intelligence and aptitude only can absorb the training. Unwilling or semi-literate students have a limited chance to compete. Why not focus on the brightest of the lot and invest in them rather than collecting the crowd? We often select the boy who is completely illiterate, not interested at all, rather than we should focus on the trainee who is willing, who is literate or semi-literate. If global competitiveness is our goal and benchmark, then we need to also look for the best and trainable talent that is available. To conclude, the traditional way of assuming that the rural youth is a rational human being who makes his choices on a very cognitive and logical basis needs serious reflection and analysis. Appropriate psychological interventions, skillfully meshed with insights from behavior economics, is the way forward. Thus, psycho-socio-economic models and tools and strategies embodying the principles of behavior economics coupled with careful nudges must be carefully evolved and deployed. That to me appears to be a logical way forward. Thank you very much.